like to welcome Jenny Henderson up the front as our moderator of our panel session. Jenny is the editor of The Conversation, and she'll introduce her guests, one of whom needs no introduction, but I'll leave it to you, Jenny.
So Jeff, we've already heard from your talk today. I'd be interested to hear more about what you have to say about technology and leadership, because I know you've spent a bit of time and know a lot of people in the tech industry in the US. But I think Jeff needs, no further introduction. Most of you might be familiar with a lot of his work in leadership over the years, but it's a pleasure to have you here today, Jeff. Thank you very much. I'll move on to Dr. Kate Cornick. She's an independent company. Kate has extensive experience in both business and academia. She has also served on the board of Broadband World Congress. Kate holds a PhD in electrical engineering and has previously served as the CEO of an ASX-listed technology startup, Rizon. She's held a range of executive positions within the University of Melbourne, including Director of Industry Engagement and Innovation, and she's a recognised leader in Australia's telecommunications sector. So welcome, Kate. Thanks, everyone. I'll move on to Dr. Thomas Rasmussen. If you'd like to come up, Thomas. He's previously worked as a Vice President of HR and Data and Analytics at Shell and had held various roles at AP Moller Maersk. He's received a PhD in psychology from the University of Aarhus, Denmark, where he's alumni in year 2006. Still does research for fun, and his papers are on HR analytics, organisational dynamics, and many other topics. I'm glad to welcome him here today. Thank you. Move on now to Dee Monaghan. Dee is an organisational psychologist. She's over 15 years' experience in supporting individuals, teams and organisations, and shaping and designing change initiatives to embed critical behaviour change. She has deep experience in conducting leadership and cultural assessments, including both qualitative and quantitative research methods, specialising in ethnographic research methods. We're keen to hear more about that. And Dee has helped a range of clients to assess their leaders, cultures, and develop behavioural change plans and embed behavioural change programs and progress towards their desired strategic imperatives. Dee's experience spans management consulting, cultural change, leadership development, and executive coaching for clients in Asia, Africa, South America, and the US. And her specialities lie in supporting organisations to unlock the energy needed to truly drive change in themselves and others. Welcome, Dee.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start today, I think we've heard from Jeff about what ideal qualities we might look for in leaders, but I'm keen to hear from the other panellists about what you consider ideal qualities in leaders. Kate, perhaps I can start with you.
So thank you, and thank you for a fantastic talk. I have to say, it probably challenged some of my thinking a little bit, because as a leader of various organisations, I've always felt that, and always been told that inspiration is something that I see as something that I should be doing to my staff and inspiring them. But I do also see that being able to motivate staff, and often it's the motivation in the challenging situations. It's not motivating for, let's go climb Everest. It's motivating to say, let's climb out of this trench that we find ourselves in this month. That's the challenging part. That's when it really comes to pass. And the other thing is problem solving. And I think that having the capability to problem solve and know when to allow your team to problem solve and when to stand back, and so you are motivating your team to develop their own capabilities versus being able to have to take control of a crisis and be able to come in and say, actually, we're going to do it this way and this is what we've got to do, and be decisive. So it's a delicate balancing act between that, knowing when to put your foot on the throttle and when to rest it off again.
Yeah, so I'd agree with most of that, and I think if you study sort of philosophers, you can go all the way back to Aristotle and Socrates and so on, and they basically said the trait of an effective leader and/or politician is that you have to be able to lie. And that was, perhaps a little bit cynical and a different context and so on. And I think you need to manage it, but there is a certain say-do gap. So you can prettify your story, and you can sort of amplify it, and you can choose, I'm going to highlight this or highlight that and so on, if you go too far, you know, if you sort of exceed the say-do gap, people are going to call out BS, and then it's going to backfire, right? But there is sort of ample room to decide how you want to spin it. And this is what I see great leaders being able to do, right? And then it also depends on the context. So it's very different what you can sell in small confidential settings where people really know what's going on and what you want to say in a room like this with 400 people. Right?
I think I'll build on that. A lot of the work that we do at PwC is in the space of transformation. So looking at, in the context of change, be it changing an operating model, implementing a large piece of technology, we work with leaders to say, what is the version of truth that we need in order to get the change enacted? So part of that is the strategic, what we would call strategic comms, which may be the story. So how do we inspire those to go on the journey? And then there's the tactical comms of, at each stage of this change process, what do we need people to think, feel and do in order to get this thing executed? And it's quite different. And how leaders need to present those communications and show up is very different. So one of the traits that we work on, particularly during large change, is how do we build in multiple perspectives? So a leader who can take in a variety of different perspectives and actually be what we would refer to as a shapeshifter, change in the moment rather than a prescribed, be this way in this instance and you will succeed. And that's hard. And there isn't a rule book and every client is different. So it's the other piece that I would put with that is to say, yes, multiple perspectives is important. And the other would be what we've termed courageous vulnerability. So that moment when you don't exactly know the answer and you've got to step over the unknown into what might be very uncomfortable and, you know, you have to rely on your gut or your intuition. That's the piece that we work a lot with leaders to know when is that moment, and sometimes we get it wrong.
Jeff, sorry.
So I would add, so if I had to bet on intelligence versus persistence and resilience, I would bet on persistence and resilience. That every human being is going to suffer setbacks and failures and make mistakes. So and of course you want to be smart, so you have fewer of them. But the question is, what happens when you have the setback? And are you tough enough to plow through it? Can you come back from the setbacks, both in your own career, but also from the setbacks that happen in your organizations? I mean, products don't launch properly, initiatives get off track, and so then so it is really around persistence and resilience is, I think, one of the core qualities. And somebody asked me the other day, how do you develop persistence and resilience? And I'm not sure I have a good answer for that, but I'm sure it's a really crucial quality.
Some of the things that all of you have talked about are distinct human qualities which are kind of intangible and hard to get a hold of. Today we're talking about algorithms and technology. Do you think there is a role for algorithms for identifying these sort of uniquely human traits and trying to identify leaders through that?
I guess everyone's looking at me as the technologist. I mean, absolutely, I think algorithms have a really important role to help us uncover things that we don't necessarily always see. I think the question, do we want computers helping us making decisions? Absolutely. Do we want computers making decisions for us? I think depends on the circumstance. And I think, you know, when it comes to hiring, whether it's at the lowest levels of an organization through to the highest levels, I personally have some concerns about relying purely on algorithm. And I don't think that's the sort of world that I would want to participate in. I think computers are fantastic. They can do many, many things. They're not human. So,
do you think we abdicate too much responsibility to algorithms to make those decisions at the moment?
I don't think we are at the moment, but I think we're in danger of doing so. And I think one of the greatest concerns I have about that is actually that you look at the entrepreneurs that are creating these technologies. And as this CEO of LaunchVic, which is the state government startup agency, I do have to be a bit careful what I say because I'm here to promote entrepreneurship and talk about our wonderful entrepreneurs and what brilliant technologies we're creating. But very often we see young people creating technologies where they haven't had the experience in the sector. Now, if we hadn't have had the entrepreneurship, we would never have had Uber. We would never have had Airbnb. But there is something that comes with knowledge and skills and understanding deep systems that is really, really crucial. And I think very often we forget about that in entrepreneurship, and we see people, and particularly young university students, being pushed down an entrepreneurship path, which is fantastic. We want to create the jobs of the future. We need people thinking about how they create businesses for themselves rather than relying on working at NAB, working at PwC, working for government, working for universities. But at the same time, you want to be developing the tools and systems of the future with the skills that are being imparted into those systems. And I think we see a lot of technologies, including the likes of Facebook, catching up as they become more mature. And I think there's a lot of challenges about the speed at which things happen.
I think we do have to recognize, I think algorithms are obviously dangerous. I'm not sure if we include games in algorithms, because I see a lot of selection-based games, and gamification is coming as well. But you also have to keep in mind that what the old system produced was a lot of homosocial reproduction. One of the most fundamental psychological principles is that we like ourselves, and we like what looks like ourselves. And so therefore we reproduce, by gender and by ethnicity and everything else. And so when you say, I'm worried about algorithms, which of course we should be, and I'm worried about games, which we should probably also be, we have to understand that the system that we are replacing is far from perfect. That we have a system which has systematically excluded large percentages of the population. I mean, if you believe in if you go to the Silicon Valley, you would believe the only people who can be great investors are, 30 to 40-year-old white males.
Yeah. And in fact, if you take Silicon Valley and the investment, if you do blind and let algorithms run the selection process, the gender bias completely dissipates. Yes. Because algorithms are running for the process. Whereas if you have women walk into the room, they are, I think, 90% less likely to be selected by a panel of predominantly 40-year-old white men who worry about all sorts of things. And it's the same in Australia, by the way, as well. Worry about things whether women might get pregnant, what might happen if you had, God forbid, a female CEO.
God forbid.
Yeah. So
your career is over.
Yeah, it's, there are some real challenges, and that's where algorithms can completely remove bias, but they can be programmed with bias as well.
Thomas and Dee, you're both coming from an industry perspective. How are you seeing this technology being used now in the industry?
So it's being used widely in recruitment, and that it's just recruitment is a very big practical challenge, right? So take NAB, we have 150 graduate positions per year, and 50,000 people apply for them. We cannot interview everybody. We want to be fair. If we make sure, so it's not so much. I think algorithms is less the question whether or not they're used. It's more, are your algorithms actually evidence-based? Are they theory-driven? And do they have sort of deep rooting in academia? And do you have experts in your company that understand that and are able to validate it? And currently I see sort of a 50-50 split, where I see some algorithms that are, somebody just pulled them out of wherever, and others that are actually evidence-based, right? So they're frequently used in recruitment, and I actually think that's fair, and we can see that reduces bias, right? So you see gender ratios, ethnicity ratios sort of evening out. At NAB, one of the things we recently did based on our HR analytics and sort of looking at the evidence is no longer screening based on your university degree or whether or not you have a degree. For particular jobs in our call centers, because we looked at who ends up being high performers after 2-3 years. And this is objectively assessed, so it's not a manager rating, which has some bias in it. And basically, people with vocational training had an equal odds of actually being a high performer compared to somebody with a university degree, maybe not from this university, one of the others, but you know what I mean. And it turns out that you also need to look at motivation and so on. But it really depends on the job. There are other jobs where particular traits are incredibly important, and your educational background is incredibly important. Back to your point on the surgeon, right? I mean, I'm not really looking for grit or a personality trait here. I'm really looking for experience in this field, right? So it's a bit of a balance.
If we are sort of tailoring those algorithms to look for leaders in particular, if you're recruiting for that position, what sort of things need to be fed into that?
So it's so if you go back to evidence, right? So read the meta-analysis in Academy of Management journal, read Jeff's excellent books, go to Academy of Management conferences, join conferences like this. basically become friends with academics because they typically know what you should look for, right? And if you look at leadership, I mean, it's complicated. There are individual traits that are important, right? So IQ is one of them, up to a certain threshold. All other things, people that are smarter will do better. It's not the only thing, but it is important. Personality traits are important as well. You can look at Big Five. You can also look at the derailers from Hogan and so on. And then there's aspiration and motivation, right? How much do you actually want that? And that is roughly 40% of the equation. Another 40% of the equation is the context. What do you actually do to them? Which environment do you put them into? Which leaders do you give them? Which support structure do you surround them with? And the remaining 20% we have not been able to uncover yet, so we're relying on academics to figure that out. But it's always two pieces of the puzzle, and the relative importance of context versus individual factors seem to differ a little bit depending on the types of job you're looking at.
Dee, do you have anything to add?
That would be a very similar experience that we have at PwC. I guess where we hone in on is really on that resilience piece. So we understand that we're putting leaders or trying to support leaders in a very difficult environment as they go through change. And so we're particularly interested in the psychometrics around derailers, so what's potentially could go wrong and how leaders are going to react under pressure and sustained pressure. But the other piece that we look at, which is less about algorithms and sort of in this grey area, are the critical experiences that leaders have had to get them to where they are, and whether or not we can predict which critical experiences are more likely to get the result that we're after. So we did a piece of work, not at your bank, at a different bank, to look at what are the traditional lineage paths to succession in terms of talent management. And what we found through that piece of work is actually the non-traditional paths is where people tend to get those critical experiences. So very often in the corporate world, when you get put on a special project, that is considered sort of doomsday. That's no man's land in terms of where are you going to go after that. But what we found in talking to a wide variety of executives was actually in those special projects was where they gained the skills that they needed to succeed into their next role. So understanding what are some of those critical experiences, what are the psychometric derailers and personality that's likely to lead to success, and then a little bit of guessing, to be fair, in terms of how do we think this leader is going to respond when put under pressure.
Thomas, you touched on trying to find the fault with algorithms as well. So, data is important, what we're looking for with the algorithm, but how it's designed as well. And part of the role I would expect in leadership is identifying problems and problem solving. So how do we train leaders and people in industry to be good at spotting the problems with algorithms that they might not be picking up?
To be honest, I think that is basic research methodology. So my ask goes back to the universities and, what's the curriculum in executive MBAs, right? Or what do you teach our grad students, right? I still have, happy leaders coming back from an MBA talking about, and they're all, happy and they talk about purpose and, and surely that's important, right? But they're none the wiser on you actually need a longitudinal design to establish causality. You need to check for reverse causality. This is a moderator, this is a mediator, this is a confounder and so on. And then in comes given this is a relatively large industry, in comes the slick consultant from, of course, not PwC,
Yep.
and sells you an assessment suite, right? And it has competencies in them, right? If you take the Lominger stuff from Korn Ferry, competence number 34 on a very long list is humor. And apparently when you reach a certain leadership level, you need to be a little bit funny. Not too funny, but a little bit. Another one is nimble learning. Nimble learning, what is that? How do you measure it and so on, right? So I think you need to have ties with academia because you may have it when you're sort of immediately exiting or when you're a fresh grad, but over the time you simply forget it. So I think this is an opportunity to advance the scientist practitioner model that we know from the medical sciences in the management field as well. So we really rely on close ties to academia to help us out with this. And I regularly call somebody at a university and I say, so, about leadership, what's the latest findings? And they go like, oh, you need to look from this and this and this, and by the way, stay clear of learning agility and emotional intelligence. And I'm like, great.
Pretty straightforward. Kate, are you seeing that graduates now who want to move into leadership positions are coming out of universities with this type of skill, you know, to be able to identify these problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think the graduates are changing dramatically, and I think the career path, as we know, has changed. The idea that you do work and work your way through an organisation is out the window, and a lot of people are looking for faster returns. And so the question is, where do they get their experience from? And I don't think it can all be theoretically based. It has to be learnt along the way, and I think that's a real challenge for universities who are have more and more pressure to create degrees and courses that are going to serve a cohort of people to meet the needs of here and now, yet the future of work is changing so much, and we know that the average degree is now 4 point whatever years, and the average career is 3 point whatever years. So our degrees are actually longer than our careers. So I think there are some real challenges about how the universities can meet the needs of students transitioning through. I wouldn't mind going back to the former question as well around, to just pick up on algorithms and the need for leaders to be able to identify. And I think it's critical that leaders have got boards and executives and advisors around them who have a deep understanding of algorithms. You can't expect a leader to understand everything. But having the ability, and we've seen the revolution of the Chief Information Officer over the last 20 years and the role of that, but increasingly the need for cybersecurity. And cybersecurity, people think of warfare, but cybersecurity is also about understanding algorithms that are operating in your business every single day to make sure that you're operating as a fair and proper business. And I think leaders can't be expected to know that these are deep technical fields, but it's being able to know where those experts are, and having that support around you at a senior level, whether it's sitting at a board or external advisor, is just absolutely critical these days.
So the question, in addition to resilience and persistence, I think the other quality that I've seen in leaders, and I'm not sure how we either develop it or certainly measure it, it goes back to Thomas's point, is intellectual curiosity. What astounds me on an almost daily basis is how people will tell you in relatively senior roles that they haven't read a book in years, that they, you know, basically, somehow people are now proud of their ignorance, which makes me like frightened. But in any event, so I think when my fellow panelists were talking, the quality that comes through, I think, is intellect. So if you are curious and you have, as Thomas is talking about, IQ up to at least to some level, if you're curious and you're reasonably smart, you will figure out who to go to or where to go to get the answers. But if you have no curiosity, if you're not interested in asking the question in the first place, you're never going to get the answer, because you will never have asked the question. And so one of the things that characterizes the CEOs who I most admire, and the ones who've, I think, been fairly successful, is they do think, as scientists, they're always asking, you know, why did this work? Why did it not work? If we did this, what would happen? They're running experiments inside of their organization. I mean, when Gary ran Caesars, Harrah's, it used to be Harrah's, then it became Caesars, there were 3 ways to get fired. You could steal, sexually harass an associate, or do something without running an experiment first. I mean, and he would fire you if you did. So every marketing program, you need to test it out. You need to test what you do in HR. I mean, there's this idea that if the CEO likes it, we're going to do it everywhere. If the CEO doesn't like it, we're going to do it nowhere, as opposed to having a, let's learn, let's ask some questions. So intellectual curiosity, to me, is a really fundamental quality, and somehow, I don't know if there's less of it than there used to be, or I'm running into people with less of it than I used to run into, but it's a really fundamental thing to be willing to pick up the phone and call somebody, or to read anything. You have to first be interested in understanding what the answer is.
And we are seeing more of that and I guess it's sort of being bastardized a little bit in terms of agile ways of working, and looking at how can you iterate a solution to get the sort of minimum viable product. The challenge that we're having in applying agile methodology is that people are looking really at the tools rather than the mindset that actually comes with an agile way of working, which is about having a learning mindset, also having an environment or a culture where you've created enough psychological safety that people can challenge and say, actually, I think there's a different way of doing this. And until we start to recognise organisations that haven't got that environment, it's very difficult to then put in a learning or a curious mindset into that context.
I think we also have to call out, I mean, Australia is a wonderful country, and we have a very strong business system, and we have a very strong university system, but they are separated. And, you know, I'm someone who has moved between those worlds. I dropped my title of doctor purposefully because I got more meetings in places that I needed to have them without having a doctorate sat in front of my title, because I am too academic. You know, and I think this is a massive problem, that we don't value academia, and it's so refreshing to hear Nab talking about the value of having academia and the importance of academics in business. And I think there is a massive gap between our system in Australia, our business system, and our academic system, and we have to have much stronger integration between those two. And I know that universities around the country are working really hard to create that, but it is a real gap, and the respect is not there when it really comes to the crunch. I think it can be in circumstances, but as a nation, it's not.
You touched on trust there, and one of the big anxieties around algorithms is trusting them and being sure of what their output that they have. Do you think we're placing too much trust in them? Should we trust them more? And should we put more trust in the people who are designing them, or the people who are finding the faults with them? What are your thoughts on this? Jeff, maybe I can start with you.
I'm not an expert on, I'm certainly not an expert on algorithms. It is interesting to think about what we are willing to trust and what we aren't willing to trust. I mean, you know, I flew here on a 787, which is, I'm not sure I should trust because they break all the time, but in any event, you know, I mean, but you take off, I mean, before we have driverless cars, we could easily have driverless planes, because basically almost the entire flight process is completely automated. And when last time I was in Sydney in the 787, we had some problem, and 4 hours later they canceled the flight, and it was pretty clear that there was nobody on the plane, including the 3 mechanics, who could fix it. And I said to one of the mechanics, I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "They've built a machine which is too complicated." And so basically, instead of fixing it now, and this is true now for your cars, what they do is nothing can be repaired because it's all too complicated. They pull out a whole subsystem and replace it with a completely new subsystem, which they hope is because the subsystem is too complicated to be fixed. So one of the interesting, I'm not sure if this answers the question about trust, but one of the things that I think we need to be careful of in algorithms and in machines, period, is designing things that are so complicated that essentially no one understands them. And you see this certainly in finance and in banks, where they've built, you know, I mean, there was this wonderful article in The Atlantic in which somebody deconstructed the Wells Fargo financial statement and claimed that they believed that no one could understand how Wells Fargo worked, including the CEO or anybody else. That we have built things that are almost too complicated. And so part of this, then, so I think what you can trust goes back to whether or not some human being, an intelligent human being, albeit, an intelligent human being buttressed with machine learning, albeit, but somebody has to be able to understand what the hell is going on. So when people tell me, you know, there's this thing, I don't know how it works, but trust me, it does. I don't.
Do you think people understand, Kate, what algorithms are in the first place and how they're being used? But is there clarity around the process?
No, I think more often than there's not, and I think you know, from an entrepreneur point of view, there's often a reason that there's not, and people don't want you to know because that's their IP, and that's what they're trading on. So yeah, I think that the world is increasingly being muddied, and I think I totally agree with everything Jess just said, and I also think it goes the other way. You don't want it to be too simple, where you're seeing these algorithms come out to say, you know, here's just a really basic recruitment algorithm. And this is how we're going to place senior leaders. So it's just it's making sure we don't get too complex, we don't go too simple, we find a happy middle in the middle, which I agree should be based on somebody understanding that system who's got intelligence.
Yeah. And I'd agree. So there's a standing joke about sort of this AI algorithm space, right? So when you're pitching to an investor, you call it AI. When you're recruiting people, you call it machine learning. And if you talk to the people about what they're actually doing, they're doing linear regressions, right? So there is a fair amount.
Learn 3 Keywords to watch for. They're all out there.
There's a fair amount of hype in this space, right? So one of the products I've seen many companies sort of grapple with is like turnover prediction, right? And people go all Minority Report. You can predict what's going to happen before it's going to happen. It's predictive analytics, and essentially, if you unpick the algorithms, right, it's basically we have a person, right, who is it's a high performer. They are paid below the 80th percentile compared to their peer group. Their boss is an idiot or a douche, according to the
technical term.
Yeah.
Yep.
They've just been passed over for a promotion, and they live far away from work. If you have those things, 80% likelihood they're going to quit, right? That's not. You don't need an algorithm for that. So it's more that there's some stuff on that, and then I think there's another thing. So I very much agree on a pragmatic approach. So you need science to supplement and augment intuition, business experience, and common sense, right? And that can elevate the quality of the discussions, and then it leads to better decisions over time. But I see analytics as an input. It's not what actually drives the decision. People are much less rational than we sometimes think, including very senior managers, right? So I know a large company in Silicon Valley where the people analytics team, some of them from Stanford, most of them actually, developed an algorithm that would predict who's going to be the high performer, right, and high potential in 2 years. But this company meets once a year. All the managers get together at a hotel, and then they decide who's going to get promoted, right? And they actually showed these managers that this algorithm, based on solid science, was better at predicting who was going to be the best performers than the managers were last time around. But the managers of this tech company, and they're all scientifically trained, they rejected it. And they had two reasons. Reasons number one, what was valid, right? So what was predictive in the past might not be predictive in the future. I buy that, and you replicate bias and so on. The other thing was you take out the gossip factor and the power of actually being a manager. You need buy-in. What's the fun of being a leader if you can't make any decisions, right? So there's a bit of a balance, and I think what will mature evidence-based practice is really how do we get leaders to see the value of it and to actually use it, but we're never going to get to a place where leadership is replaced by machines, I think.
I think trust, and this is, I guess, my personal opinion, the thing that sits closest to trust is risk. So how do we manage and mitigate our risk of making a poor decision, of not following the evidence, whatever it might be that leads to a potential disaster? And we're seeing more and more, particularly in regulated environments, that's an increasing concern for executives in boards, that we're managing the risk. The problem that does to trust is increase the cynicism. So when we start being more concerned with the risk and putting in algorithms to help solve for decisions, we take away the accountability of individual leaders. And we're seeing increasingly in organisations that accountability is one of the biggest drivers of poor performance, or lack thereof of accountability. So I think there's a balance between where can we rely on science, and we know that there's enough evidence, but we also need to move the accountability to the leaders so that they're making the right decisions, and in the eye of society, they're seen to be owning and being accountable for those choices, so that we can increase the trust that society is currently not having with a lot of our institutions.
Is there a role, do you think, for algorithms for addressing some of the problems that we've talked about already? So what Jeff's touched on, bridging the gap between the expectations of what leaders should do and what they do, or perhaps gender balance, we were talking about before, some of the processes in identifying leaders. Is there a role for algorithms to address some of that, do you think?
Absolutely. I think that, megadata, what algorithms can do is synthesize a whole lot of information, and I'm no expert in this area, to actually then give you a short list of choice that you can make. So we're able to look at, whether or not we're recruiting in a diverse way, whether or not we are taking all of the aspects that are important from an organisation's strategic direction that we espouse to, be it our values and purpose, and say, let's get a whole bunch of data, and we're able to say with a degree of confidence that we're predicting X type of person. I think there's still an opportunity for intuition or accountability to make the human choice to say, actually, this doesn't feel right.
Yeah. So I agree very much with the caveat that it needs to be theory-informed and evidence-based. So basically standing on the shoulders of 100 years of academia, because there's enough. I mean, I can do 400 correlations on leadership potential before lunch. And just by the conventional 5% probability rule or statistical significance, I'm going to find 20 things that are completely random, right? Have you seen this research that CEOs that run marathons have more profitable companies? I should give my CEO a running coach and so on. So I think the danger with big data is that if it's not theory-based or theory-informed, then it just becomes blah. So I'm less interested in having a lot of data. I want the right data, and it needs to be built on sound theoretical models, preferably with good meta-analysis in tier 1 journals, and so it's validated, right? So I think, and currently there's a bit of a tipping point where you see a bit of both, right?
Okay, do you have anything to add?
No, I would completely agree with all my comments.
What's the best practice, do you think? I'd be interested in what all of you think about the best practice in terms of algorithms being used as they are. We've talked about the right data, how that's being used, identifying the right formation of an algorithm, how much trust we put in them. What is the best case that you've seen of an algorithm being used? We all know what the problems are. What are the best ones? Anyone? I've stumped.
I'm slightly biased because I ran an HR technology company, so I could say it was our technology.
Well, you should. What is your technology?
So we developed a technology that was low-skilled workforces, effectively casualised labour and making sure that it was compliant with local labour laws. And it was a way for people to recruit effectively, Uber for staffing, but compliant with local laws. And it's still going, and that was a very low level. It wasn't even about recruitment. It was more around just getting people who had done a job previously into a job. So it might have been an event or something like that. I personally have seen very little of algorithms in action in my role in my recruitment. I mean, we certainly use headhunters, and they've used algorithms and come to us and presented information to me to make decisions from, but they've already done the algorithms in the back end, so we're pretty hands-off in that process. But you may have had much more experience than I have.
Yep. So I've seen a number of good examples. So one recent one from NAB is basically, motivation is incredibly important, or we call it employee engagement. So at NAB we've been able to look at, okay, if we take 5 or 7 years of data and we look across 220 branches that are tiered, and we can sort of test for all these things that you need to test for, we can tell that motivation or engagement actually explains 21% of variance in our performance. So having a bunch of people that are really motivated in the staff branch actually leads to the bank making more money and customer satisfaction being significantly higher. And if we translate it into financial terms, it's 1.2 billion a year of NAB's profit, right? And that's very useful to then say, okay, what do we then need to do? And it leads back to leadership. And we looked at, okay, what then drives motivation? And at NAB, we're able to identify that 26% of the variance in employee engagement has to do with the quality or how you personally assess your immediate leader, which is the single biggest factor. There are other things as well, and it's consistent across our different businesses and so on. So we go back to, okay, leadership is really important. Then we double tap leaders, right? Because you can look at the average engagement score, but most companies will have the largest group of leaders will actually be quite good, fairly outstanding. That's typically 40%. Then you have a squeezed middle that are sort of, I'm not appalling, but I'm not very good either. And then most companies will have around 25% of leaders that have no clue. If you then intervene and try and see, can they improve? Around 60% of them can improve with a targeted intervention, and 40% cannot. So for me, this algorithm leads to the fundamental choice, sort of at the end of the day, there are some leaders in leadership positions that cannot improve. How do you remove them in a respectful way? Because collateral damage is lower motivation, lower productivity, and so on. I've seen other examples. So at Shell, they were able to predict 40% of workplace accidents leading back to motivation, which was then primarily driven by the quality of leadership as well. So it's also about sending your colleagues safely home to your family, right? It's not just about money and stuff like that. I've seen examples in diversity. So a young econometrician, Linda van Leuven from Shell, she won the Wharton People Analytics Prize last year for this, looking at effective teams and diversity. And she was basically able to say that you need to look at multiple aspects of diversity, not just gender or age or education. You need to look at all of it and use the appropriate stats used to do that. And also making sure that it's balanced so you don't have subgroups that look like each other. And if you do that and you have inclusion, that's when you get the creativity and the increased performance. But if you don't have that balance and you don't have inclusion, it's actually worse than just, or everybody's the same on the team. So there's some quite good examples out there, I think.
Do you see anything?
So where we, I guess, tend to use algorithms and analytics the most is in personality of leaders, being predictive of whether or not they're going to be derailed and the degree to which they'll likely be derailed in their role. So we use Hogan a lot. We use Leadership Circle as key ways of understanding the impact that leaders can have in role in order to try and prepare for what may be a very large and substantial change, both for them as an individual but those that they lead. We also have a lot of assessment tools that we use within the work that we do, be it from a risk culture perspective, where we've found that one of the leading drivers across most of the sectors that we've run this work in is a leader's ability to communicate actually can drive the experience and the risk behaviours that we see in organisations, which was quite a surprise to us because intuitively you would think it would be something else. So once we know what those drivers are, and of course they're different for each client, we can then start to work on how do we build that muscle within the organisation. From a team perspective, so looking at how we align teams towards a purpose, the key driver that we've seen through the assessment that we've done there is this notion of emotional commitment. So how committed are the teams to understanding each other's, have they got skin in the game? Do they know personal stories about one another? So that was seen to be a higher driver than, say, having really clear performance goals.
How worried do you think we should be about data breaches? We've seen a lot of data accidentally being leaked to the public through a number of companies, and there seems to be an anxiety about how this has been collected and protected and security. Do you think we should be worried about that and the use of algorithms selecting leaders?
So I'll give you an answer. I think we shouldn't be worried at all because I think you should assume that all your data has been compromised. That, in the words of a friend of mine who ran, or still runs, security for Wells Fargo, she said there's two kinds of banks: the banks that have been hacked and the banks that don't know yet. and what I have said in the U.S., particularly after the Equifax thing, but even before that 100% of the U.S. population has had their social security numbers compromised. There's not a question in my mind about that. And I'm sure this is true in Australia as well. Whatever your comparable identifier is has been hacked. So most security firms that I know now and most organizations assume that the data is going to be hacked, is going to be breached, and they're into now further containing the damage. And I think with respect to individuals, I've advocated this is going nowhere in the United States, that the way you protect yourself against this is that you have basically free and unlimited access to your credit reports and to anything else. And you need to presume that the data have been hacked and that have been breached. And this is true for organizations as well. So this idea that somehow NAB or any other bank or any other organization, PwC, my presumption is that I could go onto the dark web and pay a certain amount of money, and somebody could give me every payroll record for PwC probably in 5 or 10 minutes. And so the presumption needs to be not that you're going to prevent the hacking, but that you were going to put in place a set of steps to contain the damage and to offer people relatively quick discovery and relatively easy and inexpensive remediation. And so, which we have in fact not done. That would be my completely unexpert view of it.
As the technologist, what's your
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I certainly agree that there's data out there that's hacked, and much of what people try to protect probably already has been hacked. We just don't know about it. I think from a workplace point of view, the biggest concern as a CEO in a government organisation in the context of any data being hacked is the reputation and the risk that then causes. And then when you're talking about that from an HR perspective, it's how do you manage the collateral damage within the organisation? We're just talking about payroll reports. There would be real concern of staff discovering other payroll of other team members that they may feel are on different salaries and have perceptions shown to be truths or otherwise. And there is really serious damage that can be caused to an organisation by data being leaked within an organisation, as well as of course externally, and it depends what you're dealing with. And I think it's something that we have to take incredibly seriously, and I think we need, very few organisations have that technology understanding at the highest levels to therefore even start to plan about what they do in that sort of an event, let alone be putting in place the steps to prevent that from happening in the first place. So I think this is just something that is so incredibly important. And we see the AICD paying far more attention to cybersecurity and having that knowledge at board level and executive level. Cybersecurity was a non-word a few years ago, and now it either is or should be on everyone's board agenda as a serious topic, and it's how you manage that in a crisis, and what is that data and who does it impact.
We are talking about very sensitive data here. If we're talking about people's skills or their ambition, identifying those trends, it would be, potentially quite damaging for certain employees, for others to know about that.
Yeah, so I think, so a couple of points. I agree with your notion, and I think let's not be naive. That said, if you are a professional criminal, you're not primarily interested in a payroll list, because that's not where the money is, right? You go for the assets or the natural gas reserves, or you have any dirt, right? I think data privacy I think we can learn a lot from academia here again, because it's about, how do you treat people that are part of an experiment, and data ethics, and, people opt in. Do you have a legitimate business reason, making sure you only share results at aggregate and so on? And then I think there is a bit of boundaries are being pushed by startups, right? So 2013, when I joined Shell, the fun thing about working for Shell is you have unlimited resources in HR, right? You have an idea, here's 20 million, go do it, right? Fly to London, meet with IBM, and they fly people in from Silicon Valley, and I was like, give me the, get Watson from the basement, and give me the all singing, all dancing AI thing, right? And the best proposal they had was, we can develop an app for you, where you give us the company data about talent, performance, all of that stuff, and we suck LinkedIn data. And then if you have a high-performing female, let's call her Linda, if she goes and update her profile and goes like, by the way, I also speak German, which is typically a sign that you're sort of putting a feeler out in the market, the manager will get an email, and then I can go talk to them, right? Which is creepy. And back to your point about trust, I don't think that's, so let's be careful that we don't use these gadgets to supplement leadership, right? It should augment it, really. Yeah.
So I don't know much about cybersecurity. What we are getting asked a lot about at the moment is, and just yesterday I was on a call about running a training program around risk controls, and not as a risk controls expert, but more as the request from the client was, we want to talk more than just compliance. So this isn't about ticking a box to say we've run training within our organisation, but what we want to understand is, what are the critical behaviours that are likely to put us in hot water, and how can we identify what they are, and then how can we create an experience through a training program where people viscerally feel what it's like to actually choose the wrong behaviour, and then let's go back and understand the controls. So I think there's a couple of things. One is the acceptance that absolutely, it's a new world out there where we are likely to have data breaches, but how we respond to those and the message that we put out to our shareholders, to our stakeholders, to the community, and the level or degree of truth that we tell, I think is critical. And then what are the behaviours that we identify as being the most important in order to make sure that we're mitigating that risk as much as possible without increasing the level of cynicism by pretending that we've got an issue that, or pretending that we don't have an issue when we really do.
Now I'm about to open up to questions, so if you have any, please write them down, keep them in your head, but I thought we'd take an opportunity, seeing as we're talking about the future of work, to ask each of you to finish, I guess, your comments on what do you think is next for algorithms being used in leadership or talent identification?
I was once on a conference with a famous futurist, Alvin Toffler, who's now deceased, and I really upset him by saying that that the future is actually very hard to predict. and in fact, the evidence for that is to go back and look at past forecasts of future, both of just simple economic projections, but also projections about what was going to happen in various domains of technology. So I basically don't predict the future, except to quote Abraham Lincoln, that the future comes one day at a time. And so that you better take care of tomorrow. But our predictions about the future, I think, are notoriously inaccurate. So I try not to do that. And Alvin Toffler looked at me and he was just furious. But I said, by the way, it's true for you too. Go back.
Okay. I would say you're definitely going to see more and more startups working in this area, and you'll see a proliferation of AI, machine learning, and many other terms that we've used today. And I'd also say that it's actually something that Melbourne is proliferating in. I think it's off the back of Seek and having such a strong unicorn, billion-dollar startup in the HR industry. We've seen a proliferation of younger HR industries, companies, and if people often ask me what's the best startup in Melbourne at the moment, and there are many, but in the HR field, CultureAmp is an organisation that is absolutely taking over Silicon Valley at the moment. It's doing phenomenally well, and it's in culture and organisation and algorithms and learning, and you're just going to see more and more of that, both from developed in Melbourne but also globally.
Let me say one thing. So one of the things that concerns me a lot, I have a friend named Mikhail Kaczynski who's famous because he developed a program that permitted Donald Trump to win the presidency, even though he does not work for Cambridge Analytica. And he now has a program which predicts, off of Facebook pictures, with a very high degree of accuracy, gender orientation, particularly for men. There is no privacy left. So, and I heard him give a fabulous talk in the technology museum of Silicon Valley, and people said, he said, I haven't destroyed technology at all, but with machine learning and with people not having anything private, there is no secret. There are no secrets. There is no privacy, and I'm not sure which terrifies me more: no security or no privacy. And I said to him, well, my wife has made it a practice to have no Facebook account, have no this, have no that, have no the other thing. He said, you would be surprised, even with people who don't live on the web, let alone for everybody in this room who does live on the web, what we can find. There is basically no privacy left. And that, to me, is terrifying. That every behavior, every aspect of your financial life, every aspect of your personal life, every aspect of your sex life that you thought was private, none of it is. And so, God help you.
But don't be anxious. Thomas.
Yeah, so how do I follow that? So I think I'd rather answer what I'd like to see happen, because it is hard to make predictions about the future. I'd like for the management HR field to move forward on the scientist practitioner model. So a plea to this room, please help us. We're friendly people. Give us a call, we'll return your phone call and so on. How can we run small experiments? How can we work with your grad students on giving them data? How can we really get this evidence-based, right? And I think the upside for companies is that you'll actually be able to spend less on HR and management training, but get a higher impact, and we'll be able to create better workplaces. That's what I hope might happen.
I think it's boring to say ditto, but I would echo those sentiments. From a desire perspective, what we're seeing from a request, so as a professional services firm, what people are asking for of us more is digitising the way people learn, digitising how we create critical experiences within organisations, also how we assess and recruit. So we're seeing a lot more from augmented reality, virtual reality, from a training perspective. So I think there'll be far more of that. As I head down my own path of my own little leadership journey here, I know that the world that this bub is going to grow up in is completely different to the world that I know. So I think from our own experience is the adaptation and being open to what's coming down the pipe, because similar to Jeffrey, I don't know. I don't know what the future holds, but I think we need to be open and move with it.
All right. I'd like to take time now to thank our speakers. Of course, Jeff Pfeffer, Professor of Organisational Behaviour at Stanford University, Kate Cornick, CEO at Launch Victoria, Thomas Rasmussen, General Manager of People Analytics, Insight and Experience at NAB, and Dee Monaghan, who is Director of People and Culture at PwC. So please join me in thanking them.